Respect is not granted because you ask for it. It is not secured through endless explanations, emotional appeals, or attempts to convince people that your limits matter. Respect emerges when others encounter a person whose boundaries are so clear, so consistent, and so firmly rooted in character that violating them becomes costly. This is one of the most misunderstood truths in human relationships. Many people believe boundaries are something you announce. The Stoics understood that boundaries are something you embody. Think about how most people respond when someone repeatedly ignores their limits. They explain themselves again. They negotiate. They justify. They become frustrated. Then they explain even more. In the process, they unknowingly teach others a dangerous lesson. They teach people that every boundary is flexible, every principle can be debated, and every decision is open for negotiation if enough pressure is applied. The ancient Stoics saw this pattern everywhere. Human beings often surrender their peace, not because others are powerful, but because they abandon control over themselves. They become consumed by what other people think, how other people react, and whether other people approve. The result is a life spent managing external forces, instead of governing the only thing that truly belongs to them, their own choices. Marcus Aurelius spent years surrounded by criticism, political manipulation, betrayal, and endless demands upon his attention. Yet he repeatedly returned to a simple principle. You cannot control the behavior of others. You can only control your response. This idea is not passive. It is one of the most powerful forms of strength a human being can possess. When someone ignores your boundary, the real challenge is rarely their behavior. The real challenge is whether you will remain faithful to your own standards. Most people become emotionally trapped because they focus entirely on changing the other person. The Stoic focuses on something far more important. He asks whether his actions remain aligned with his values. Imagine a person who constantly interrupts your time, demands your energy, and expects immediate access to your attention. The common reaction is irritation mixed with compliance. You become resentful, yet you continue saying yes. Every reluctant agreement sends a silent message. It tells the other person that persistence works. It teaches them that your words matter less than your eventual surrender. Respect cannot grow in that environment. The Stoic approach is different. Instead of becoming angry, instead of delivering dramatic speeches, instead of trying to control another person's behavior, you quietly enforce your standard. You decide what is acceptable. You communicate it clearly. Then you act consistently. Consistency is where most people fail. Anyone can declare a boundary when emotions are high. Anyone can promise that things will be different. The true test arrives when enforcement becomes uncomfortable. It arrives when someone becomes disappointed. It arrives when criticism appears. It arrives when guilt begins whispering that maintaining your standards makes you selfish. At that moment, many people retreat. They trade long-term self-respect for short-term comfort. The Stoics understood that comfort is often the enemy of strength. Every meaningful boundary carries a cost. Someone may become upset. Someone may misunderstand you. Someone may accuse you of changing. Yet if your boundary is reasonable, if it protects your integrity, your time, your purpose, and your peace of mind, then accepting that cost becomes part of your responsibility. This is where the dichotomy of control becomes essential. You control your decision. You do not control their reaction. Read that again carefully. You control your decision. You do not control their reaction. Much suffering comes from confusing these two things. People attempt to create boundaries while simultaneously trying to manage everyone's feelings about those boundaries. The result is exhaustion. They become trapped in endless negotiations designed to avoid discomfort. But every attempt to control another person's emotional response places your peace in their hands. The Stoic refuses this arrangement. He understands that another person's disappointment is not automatically evidence that he has done something wrong. Sometimes disappointment is simply the natural consequence of encountering a limit. Sometimes anger appears because access has been restricted. Sometimes criticism emerges because expectations have changed. Asterisk. The question is never whether someone is pleased. The question is whether your actions are consistent with wisdom and virtue. Consider the example of the Roman statesman and philosopher Seneca. He lived in a world filled with political intrigue, public scrutiny, and dangerous power struggles. Yet throughout his writings he repeatedly warned against becoming a servant to public opinion. He observed that people who chase approval become vulnerable to manipulation because they allow others to determine their choices. The moment approval becomes your priority, your boundaries begin to disappear. Why? Because every boundary creates the possibility of disapproval. If you say no, someone may dislike it. If you protect your time, someone may complain. If you refuse manipulation, someone may become offended. If you stopped tolerating disrespect, someone may call you difficult. The approval seeker cannot endure these outcomes. Therefore, he gradually sacrifices his standards. The Stoic understands something different. Character matters more than popularity. This realization changes everything. You stop measuring success by the number of people who agree with you. You stop evaluating your worth through external validation. You stop seeking permission to protect what matters. And strangely enough, this is often when respect begins to appear. Not because people suddenly become kinder, not because the world changes, but because human beings instinctively recognize conviction. They recognize when a person possesses internal stability. They recognize when decisions are not dictated by fear, pressure, or emotional manipulation. Many people confuse niceness with virtue. The Stoics never made this mistake. Virtue does not mean endless accommodation. Virtue means acting according to reason and principle. There is a profound difference. A person who says yes to everything is not necessarily kind. Sometimes he is afraid. Sometimes he fears rejection. Sometimes he fears conflict. Sometimes he fears disappointing others. Fear disguised as kindness remains. Fear. True kindness can include saying no. True kindness can include refusing unreasonable demands. True kindness can include maintaining limits that preserve your ability to fulfill higher responsibilities. Without boundaries, generosity becomes self-destruction. Without boundaries, compassion becomes exhaustion. Without boundaries, service becomes resentment. This is why so many people feel trapped in relationships, workplaces, and social environments that drain them. They believe sacrifice automatically creates virtue, yet sacrifice without wisdom often creates bitterness. The Stoics sought balance. They understood that a person must govern himself before he can effectively contribute to the world. Imagine a fortress built on weak foundations. No matter how noble its purpose, it eventually collapses. The same principle applies to human character. If your emotional energy, focus, and discipline are constantly consumed by other people's demands, you lose the capacity to pursue meaningful goals. This brings us to one of the most powerful and least understood forms of boundary setting: strategic silence. Most people reveal too much. They explain every decision. They defend every choice. They announce every plan. They react to every criticism. The Stoics viewed this behavior as unnecessary. When your actions are guided by principle, excessive explanation becomes a form of weakness. It reflects a hidden desire for validation. Think about how much energy people waste trying to convince critics. They argue online. Asterisk. They defend themselves to people who have already made up their minds. They explain decisions to individuals who are not genuinely seeking understanding. In doing so, they surrender something valuable: their attention. Attention is one of the most precious resources you possess. Every minute spent defending yourself is a minute not invested in growth. Every emotional reaction feeds the very dynamic you wish to escape. Marcus Aurelius advised himself repeatedly not to become distracted by the judgments of others. He understood that criticism is often unavoidable. If you act, some will disagree. If you succeed, some will resent you. If you change, some will resist. The answer is not to stop acting. The answer is to stop treating every opinion as a command. A boundary gains strength when it is accompanied by silence. You do not need to announce every standard. You do not need to justify every refusal. You do not need to win every argument. Sometimes the strongest response is calm. Consistency. Someone violates your limit. You enforce the consequence. No drama. No emotional explosion. No lengthy debate. Just action. This is precisely why strategic scarcity creates respect. When people know they cannot endlessly access your attention, your energy, or your availability, they begin to value those things differently. Scarcity changes perception. Notice how individuals often take for granted what is constantly available. Endless accessibility creates familiarity, and familiarity often breeds disregard. This does not mean becoming cold or arrogant. It means becoming intentional. Your time should have standards. Your attention should have standards. Your emotional investment should have standards. Not everyone deserves unrestricted access to the most valuable parts of your life. The Stoics recognize that life itself is limited. Every hour spent carelessly can never be recovered. Seneca devoted entire essays to the idea that people guard their money more carefully than their time, despite time being infinitely more precious. When you truly understand this, boundaries stop feeling selfish. They begin to feel necessary. You realize that every unnecessary obligation steals energy from your highest priorities. You realize that every avoidable distraction delays meaningful progress. You realize that protecting your focus is not an act of hostility toward others. It is an act of responsibility toward yourself. And this is where discipline enters the conversation, because maintaining boundaries is ultimately an internal battle. The greatest threat to your boundaries is rarely another person. It is your own desire to avoid discomfort. It is your own temptation to seek approval. It is your own fear of being misunderstood. This is why boundary setting is fundamentally a Stoic practice. It demands self-mastery. It demands emotional control. It demands the ability to endure temporary discomfort for the sake of long-term integrity. Anyone can maintain standards when circumstances are easy. The test arrives when pressure increases. The test arrives when guilt appears. The test arrives when someone important disapproves. That is when character reveals itself. And that is when respect begins to grow, not only from others, but from within, because the deepest form of respect is self-respect. When you repeatedly abandon your principles, something inside you notices. Confidence weakens, conviction fades, doubt increases. But when you honor your values despite resistance, a different transformation occurs. You begin trusting yourself. You begin believing your own words. You begin recognizing that your choices are not controlled by external forces. That inner certainty becomes visible. People can sense it. They may not understand why. They may not even consciously recognize it. But they feel the presence of someone who cannot be easily manipulated. Someone who values principle above approval. Someone who remains steady amid pressure. And in a world where so many people are controlled by the opinions, expectations, and demands of others, such steadiness becomes extraordinarily rare. Rare things command respect. Most people assume respect is earned through impressive words, social status, physical presence, or the ability to dominate others. Yet if you study history carefully, you will discover that some of the most respected individuals possessed none of these advantages. Their influence came from something far more enduring. They developed an inner authority that could not be purchased, borrowed, or granted by the crowd. The Stoics devoted their lives to cultivating this inner authority. They understood that respect begins as an internal condition before it ever becomes an external result. A person who lacks command over his own impulses will eventually struggle to command respect from anyone else. This is not because others are cruel. It is because human beings instinctively recognize inconsistency. When your words say one thing, but your actions reveal another, trust begins to disappear. Consider how many people establish boundaries only to abandon them the moment resistance appears. They promise themselves they will stop tolerating disrespect. They swear they will protect their time. They declare that certain behaviors will no longer be accepted. Yet the first time someone challenges those limits, everything collapses. A difficult conversation appears, an uncomfortable confrontation emerges. A wave of guilt rises. Suddenly the boundary vanishes. The lesson received by others is immediate. They learn that your standards are conditional. They learn that persistence can override your convictions. They learn that pressure works. This is why discipline matters more than declarations. Stoics believed that character is built through repeated action. Every time you uphold a reasonable boundary despite discomfort, you strengthen your internal foundation. Every time you choose principle over convenience, you become more stable. Every time you resist the urge to seek approval at the expense of integrity, you become more trustworthy in your own eyes. And this process creates a powerful transformation. You stop viewing boundaries as defensive walls. You begin seeing them as expressions of identity. A boundary is ultimately a statement about what you value. If you value your focus, distractions receive limits. If you value your peace, chaos receives limits. If you value your purpose, unnecessary obligations receive limits. If you value your self-respect, disrespectful behavior receives limits. The boundary itself is not the point. The value being protected is the point. Many people become trapped because they focus on controlling external behavior rather than protecting internal priorities. They become obsessed with whether others understand their decisions. Yet understanding is not required. A person does not need to agree with your boundaries for those boundaries to be valid. This realization is liberating. Imagine carrying a heavy object for years because everyone around you expected you to carry it. Perhaps it is an obligation that no longer serves a meaningful purpose. Perhaps it is a relationship built entirely on one-sided sacrifice. Perhaps it is a pattern of constant availability that leaves no time for your own growth. One day you decide to set the burden down. What happens? People who benefited from your willingness to carry it may object. Some may accuse you of becoming selfish. Some may remind you of old expectations. Some may attempt to make you feel guilty, but their reaction does not determine whether your decision was wise. The Stoics repeatedly emphasize this distinction. Wisdom is not measured by popularity. Virtue is not determined by consensus. A sailor navigating through a storm does not abandon the compass simply because frightened passengers disagree with the direction. He follows what is true. Likewise, a person committed to integrity cannot allow every external opinion to redirect his course. This is where immunity to criticism becomes essential. Many boundaries fail because people fear judgment more than exhaustion. Think about that carefully. They fear criticism more than burnout. They fear disapproval more than resentment. They fear temporary conflict more than long-term suffering. As a result, they continue living in ways that slowly drain their energy, confidence, and peace. The Stoics challenged this tendency directly. Epictetus taught that if you wish to improve, you must be willing to appear foolish in the eyes of others. This lesson contains immense power. The moment you stop requiring universal approval, your freedom expands dramatically. You become capable of making decisions based on reason rather than fear. You become capable of pursuing meaningful goals despite misunderstanding. You become capable of protecting your time without apologizing for its value. Criticism loses much of its power when you understand its true nature. Most criticism says more about the critic than the target. Some criticism comes from projection. Some comes from envy. Some comes from misunderstanding. Some comes from people who feel threatened. When familiar dynamics begin to change, this does not mean all criticism should be ignored. The Stoics never advocated arrogance. Constructive feedback remains valuable. Wise counsel remains valuable. Objective self-examination remains valuable. But there is a profound difference between learning from criticism and becoming enslaved by it. One strengthens character, the other destroys it. A person obsessed with avoiding criticism eventually becomes predictable. He adjusts himself constantly to satisfy shifting expectations. His identity becomes fragmented because it depends entirely upon external reactions. The Stoic chooses a different path. He listens, he reflects, he learns, but ultimately he answers to his principles rather than the crowd. This creates a stability that few people ever achieve, and stability generates respect. Not immediate respect, not universal respect, but genuine respect, the kind rooted in consistency rather than performance. The kind that survives changing circumstances. The kind that cannot be withdrawn because it was never dependent on popularity in the first place. Yet there is another challenge that every person encounters while establishing boundaries. The challenge of adversity. Sooner or later, maintaining your standards will cost you something. An opportunity may disappear. Relationship may change. A friendship may fade. An invitation may stop arriving. At first, these losses can feel painful. But this is precisely where one of the most powerful Stoic principles emerges: amor fati, the love of fate. Most people merely tolerate difficulties. The Stoics sought something greater. They sought to embrace difficulties as necessary ingredients in their development. Imagine a sculptor working with a block of marble. Every strike of the hammer removes something. From a certain perspective, the stone is losing material. Yet from another perspective, the sculpture is being revealed. The same principle applies to life. Every challenge reveals character. Every setback reveals priorities. Every obstacle reveals weaknesses that can be strengthened. When boundaries cause friction, many people interpret the discomfort as evidence they are doing something wrong. The Stoic asks a different question. What if this difficulty is the very thing that strengthens me? What if this criticism is teaching me emotional resilience? What if this disappointment is teaching me detachment? What if this resistance is forcing me to clarify my values? Suddenly the obstacle changes meaning. It ceases to be an enemy. It becomes training. Marcus Aurelius famously reminded himself that the obstacle becomes the way. What blocks progress can become progress itself when approached with wisdom. This principle applies directly to boundaries. Every challenge becomes an opportunity to strengthen discipline. Every moment of pressure becomes an opportunity to practice self-control. Every temptation to abandon your standards becomes an opportunity to reinforce them. Over time, something remarkable happens. What once felt difficult becomes natural. What once required effort becomes habit. What once triggered anxiety becomes ordinary. You no longer need to fight for every boundary because your identity has changed. You have become the kind of person who naturally protects what matters. And perhaps this is the deepest lesson of all. Boundaries are not ultimately about keeping people out. They are about keeping yourself aligned. Aligned with your values, aligned with your purpose, aligned with your highest potential. Too many people spend their lives reacting to criticism, reacting to expectations, reacting to pressure, reacting to demands. Their direction is determined by external forces. The Stoic seeks something different. He seeks sovereignty. Not control over others. Control over himself, not dominance. Discipline. Not endless validation. Inner certainty. This certainty becomes a quiet source of power. It does not need to announce Itself. It does not need to intimidate anyone. It does not need to prove anything. Its strength lies in consistency. A tree does not argue with the wind. A mountain does not negotiate with the storm. They remain what they are. The Stoics admired this kind of steadiness. A person grounded in principle does not change with every opinion that passes through the world. He remains anchored to what he knows is right. Such a person becomes increasingly difficult to manipulate. Guilt loses its power. Pressure loses its power. Criticism loses its power. Not because he becomes emotionless, but because he understands what belongs within his control and what does not. He knows that other people's reactions belong to. Then his responsibility is his character. His responsibility is his conduct. His responsibility is his choices, nothing more, nothing less. And this understanding creates a freedom that many people spend their entire lives searching for. The freedom to say no without guilt, the freedom to walk away from disrespect, the freedom to protect your peace, the freedom to pursue meaningful goals without seeking permission, the freedom to remain calm when others become emotional, the freedom to be misunderstood without becoming defensive, the freedom to honor your values regardless of external pressure. Ironically, it is often after reaching this state that respect begins to arrive, not because you chased it, not because you demanded it, not because you manipulated others into providing it, but because respect naturally gravitates toward strength of character. People trust those who trust themselves. People value those who value their own time. People recognize those who live according to principles rather than impulses. And even when some refuse to respect your boundaries, something even more important remains. You respect yourself. The Stoics knew that this is the foundation upon which every meaningful life is built. For a person who possesses self-respect can endure criticism, can withstand adversity, can remain disciplined amid temptation, can maintain boundaries despite pressure, can transform obstacles into opportunities, and can walk through the world with a calm confidence that no external force can take away. Remember this whenever you feel tempted to abandon your standards for temporary approval. Every time you honor a worthy boundary, you strengthen your character. Every time you choose principle over popularity, you strengthen your character. Every time you refuse manipulation, protect your time, and remain faithful to your values, you strengthen your character. And character, unlike approval, does not disappear when circumstances change. It remains quiet, steady, unshakable. The world may or may not respect your boundaries, but if you respect them yourself, and if you uphold them with wisdom, discipline, and consistency, something extraordinary happens. You become the kind of person whose presence commands respect without ever needing to ask for it.